Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Today we have our speaker, invited guest speaker who Kate will be presenting today. And the session will be recorded.
So Dr. Jimenez received her PhD in epidemiology from Brown University School of Public Health and completed a T32 postdoctoral fellowship in cardiovascular disease and environmental epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. School of Public Health. She has a multidisciplinary research portfolio that includes spatial epidemiology, life course analysis, health disparities, cardiovascular disease, and aging, specifically geographical contextual factors and modifiers of cognitive decline and dementia. Her early work evaluated the relationship between Greenspace and hypertension among adults. More recently, she has extended this work to examine mediation analysis between Greenspace and cognitive function. Her current work focuses on novel metrics of Greenspace and the urban environment using deep learning algorithms and Google Street View images. She has extensive experience working with several cohort studies, including the New England Family Study, Project Viva, and the Nurses Health Studies, and the multi-ethnic study of atherosclerosis. She is currently funded through a K99 R00 pathway to Independence Award from the NIA, which aims to quantify the role of built and natural environment on cognitive functioning and Alzheimer's disease risk, evaluating racial and ethnic disparities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kate. Hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you very much for joining. I've had the pleasure of talking to Drs. Anderson and Watson before, and they were kind enough to invite me today to talk to you all about our research. So I want to apologize first because I was supposed to give this talk back in June, and then I got COVID and I was very sick, so apologies for that. But if without any further ado, let's go ahead. So today I'll be talking about prospective associations of Greenspace and Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. I'll start with a bit of I'll start with a bit of a background. I'll talk about my research in early life, then research later in life, future directions, and then end with some conclusions. So first, it's not changing as quickly. I'm not sure why, so apologies. Do you see the slide where I have a picture of two llamas? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I always start with a bit of myself. I'm originally from Mexico City. My family is actually originally from a city called Oruro in Bolivia. And I've been in the United States for about 10 years. I have two little ones pictured as llamas here, Emilia and Maya. And I recently joined BU as an assistant professor at the epidemiology department. And I'm very happy to be here. And I start teaching applications of intermediate epi this fall. So any advice on early career faculty or teaching, please send them my way. So while preparing for this talk, I thought how to illustrate my research interests. And I think this slide is a good representation. My research is built around a life course perspective and aim to study how does a place where we live shapes our health and well-being, dissecting the underlying mechanisms and the differential impact that this may have globally. And all within the framework of racial disparities, of course. So my work focuses on the ecological model, which states that geographic contextual factors influence health by influencing the choices and the behaviors that may produce long-term effects. So we are perhaps more aware of the individual characteristics that may put us at a higher risk for any disease, such as our age, our sex, our race, ethnicity. But our health is likewise impacted by higher order determinants, such as our access to healthy food, the natural environment, the neighborhood socioeconomic status, and even the noise that surrounds us. So for this talk, I will focus on the natural environment. And first, what I mean by natural environment is just the natural vegetation, the green space or the greenness that surrounds our residential address. Green space has been associated with cardiovascular risk factors. So people that live closer to green spaces have higher exposure to green space, have generally lower blood pressure, lower risk of diabetes and obesity. They also tend to have more opportunities to physical activity, especially about pregnancy. There's a lot of research that shows that higher exposure to greenness is associated with higher birth weight, better mental health, cognitive outcomes, and even lower risk of mortality. So for today, I'll focus on cognition. And I will start by talking about two theories that state why would greenness be associated with cognition. The first is the attention restoration theory, which states that spending time in nature has a direct restorative effect on cognition. And the idea is that natural environments invoke a sense of fascination, of being away, and compatibility that may result in the replenishment of directed attention, so that people can concentrate better after spending time in nature or even looking at scenes of nature. I noticed this myself during the pandemic. I would go outside we have a little garden. I would actually work there, and I noticed how much more productive I was. So just a tip. Then we have the stress reduction theory, which states that nature scenes activate our parasympathetic nervous system in ways that reduce stress. So if you think about it, particular natural landscapes, especially grasslands with clusters of trees, tended to provide human beings with opportunities for gain and places of refuge for safety. So these types of landscapes activate our physiology in effectively beneficial ways. So nature contact evokes a positive effect in those undergoing stress, which blocks negative thoughts and feelings. But in addition to exert direct influence on brain development, such as a few examples before, green spaces might have also indirect impacts mediated by other factors. So for instance, in this slide, we see that natural environment can have an impact on environmental factors. So more nature can reduce our exposure to noise or air pollution, and that of course will also have an impact on our health and well-being. Natural environment can also have an impact on physical activity, as we previously discussed, which will benefit our health and well-being. Natural environment has also been shown to increase opportunities for social context and reduce our stress. And lastly, it is important to note that these mechanisms have a number of possible modifiers, such as perceived safety in the green space. Our gender can also modify these associations, or age, race, and socioeconomic status. So let's begin. During my postdoctoral studies, I was interested in studying the association between green space and children's cognition. And I had the opportunity to work with an amazing team at Project Viva at Harvard. Project Viva is a pre-birth cohort that enrolled pregnant women during the 1999 to 2002 in Eastern Massachusetts. And then they followed the offspring throughout the life course. So neurodevelopment was assessed in the offspring at early childhood, around 3 years of age, and then at mid-childhood, around 8 years of age. Our sample size was about 1,000 participants. And these are the tests that we use to measure cognition. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of these tests: the Kaplan Brief Intelligence Test, the Visual Motor Subtest of the BRACMA, and the Visual Memory Index of the Wide Range Assessment of Memory and Learning. So to walk briefly through how this is done is that we have participants' addresses throughout the life course, and we geocoded the addresses, which basically means that we assigned a latitude and a longitude and we map them. So this map shows the distribution of the geographic locations of Project Viva participants. As you can see, they're mostly around the Boston area. And then for our exposure greenness, we used the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, or NDVI, which is based on Landsat satellite data on vegetation quantity at a 30-meter resolution from 1999 to 2010. So what happens is that leaves absorb solar radiation in the visible photosynthetically active wavelength, and they also scatter solar radiation to avoid overheating. So NDVI is based on the ratio of near infrared to visible light and provides a nice objective measure of vegetation quantity. So we have time-varying mean NDVI values surrounding participants' residential addresses throughout the life course. And to walk through how this is done is we take a geocoded address of a participant, and then we overlay the raster of NDVI, and we assign the value of NDVI to the participant based on the pixel that their home is in. And because of the longitudinal nature of the Project VIVA data, we were able to examine cross-sectional and longitudinal associations. So if you see in this diagram, we had greenness at 3 time points, and we had cognition at 2 time points. The dotted lines represent the longitudinal associations that we were able to assess. For instance, we were able to examine greenness at birth in association with cognition at early childhood, and greenness at birth in association with cognition at mid-childhood. But we were also able to examine cross-sectional associations, so both exposure and outcome at the same time point. So the bold lines in gray indicate those cross-sectional associations. For instance, greenness at early childhood associated with cognition also at early childhood. Please let me know if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions. So we created measures of Greenspace at the birth address in the first column, the early childhood address in the second column, and the mid-childhood address at the third column. Just to remind you that the early childhood is around age 3, and the mid-childhood is examination is around age 8. And we had 4 cognitive scores at mid-childhood. We have verbal and nonverbal intelligence, visual motor abilities, and visual memory, but I'm only presenting results for 2 of them, 1 in each row. Our aim was to examine associations of early life greenness exposure with mid-childhood cognition. So I'm presenting the longitudinal associations here. And we used generalized additive models and natural splines to evaluate deviations from linearity, which, as you can see in these plots, we found. We adjusted our models for sex, age, maternal characteristics such as IQ, education, and race, father's education, household income, and neighborhood socioeconomic status. In general, we observed positive nonlinear relationships of residential greenness at early childhood with nonverbal intelligence and visual memory. But the take home here is that we didn't see anything based on the birth exposure or the mid-childhood exposure, but we did see that more green space at the early childhood address was associated with improved nonverbal intelligence and visual memory. And this was our first hint to know that the time window of exposure might be important for early cognition. So in a second project, we were interested in evaluating greening interventions across the life course. This project was also with Project VIVA data, and given our previous findings suggesting early childhood as a sensitive period, one of the interventions that we were interested in exploring was whether somehow ensuring maximum greenness only in early childhood versus minimum through all intervals was associated with fewer neurobehavioral problems. So we used inverse probability weighting of marginal structure models, which is a fancy way to say that we wanted to test these 2 interventions, maximum greenness exposure versus minimum through all intervals, and then maximum greenness only in early childhood. So I'm not gonna bore you with formulas, but I just wanted to show you this, that to state that contrary to our previous analysis in which we analyzed only one time period at a time, in here in the formula, you can see that we assess them all together as a trajectory. So we have the probability of living in a quartile of Greenness exposure at time t, conditional on the history of Greenness exposure before time t. And that's it. I'm done with formulas. So the intervention that we tested would graphically look something like this. In blue, we have maximum Greenness exposure versus minimum through all intervals. And then the second intervention is in the red line, maximum Greenness only in early childhood versus minimum through all intervals. In mid-childhood and in early adolescence, we had measures for executive function. And as you can see from this diagram, executive function skills include self-monitoring, task initiation, task completion, etc. And long story short, results of the effect of maximum versus minimum Greenness at all time points did not suggest association with mid-childhood outcomes. But estimates of maximum Greenness only in early childhood actually suggested a beneficial association with mid-childhood strengths and difficulties questionnaire, suggesting lower neurobehavioral problems. So this was our second hint. There is something going on in early childhood and exposure to Greenness. So during my postdoc, I also applied for a K99 R00 work to study these associations later in life. So moving on the life trajectory for this project, we focused on the association between geographic context and cognitive health in older adults. My K99 R00, as Kate mentioned, was funded by the National Institute of Aging to examine the association between surrounding residential Greenness and Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And as you all know, the population of individuals 65 years or older is projected to grow from 56 million in 2020 to 95 million in 2060, which will more than double the prevalence of dementia to almost 14 million. So for this project, we used data from the Nurses' Health Study 2 cohort, which began in 1899 with about 116,000, female nurses, ages 25 to 42. They were originally from 14 states, but they have moved throughout the United States. So as you can see, we have a very broad geographic representation with at least 29 participants in each state. We had biennial addresses geocoded from 1989 to 2017. And starting in 2014, the women were invited to complete a cognitive test. So for our exposure, again, we had Greenness. We also used the normalized difference vegetation index based on Lancet satellite data, but this time we used data from 2013 so that it would be prior to the first cognitive assessment. For our outcome, we used the Cogstate Battery, which, as you know, has 4 tasks. The validity of Cogstate has been established in previous studies and has been shown to be a sensitive indicator of early cognitive deficits and Alzheimer's dementia. And based on previous research, we created 3 composite scores: a psychomotor speed attention, a learning working memory composite, and then an overall cognition composite. And these 3 scores were standardized to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1. And of course, higher scores indicate better cognitive performance. So in models adjusted for age and race, we saw that higher Greenspace exposure was associated with higher scores on the psychomotor speed attention composite and also on overall cognition. We noticed that further adjustment for childhood, adulthood, and neighborhood socioeconomic status, which are major confounders of these associations, did not attenuate our results, and they basically remained unchanged. We also observed that Greenspace exposure was associated with higher scores on the learning and working memory composites, but these associations did not reach statistical significance. So as you can see, the confidence interval included the null. And because of the rich data that we had in the cohort, sorry, an ambulance is passing by. We were also able to explore the potential mechanisms through which nature might affect cognitive health. So we conducted a mediation analysis where we saw that physical activity and air pollution did not explain much of the association between greenness and cognition, but depression actually did explain about 6% of the greenness and cognition relationship. And then in sensitivity analysis, for folks that are more interested in the methods part, we also address the fact that the mediators of interest could also be confounders. And we observed that adjustment for depression, air pollution, and physical activity in the main models did not change the association between Greenspace and cognition. So the null associations that we saw between Greenspace and learning and working memory, are in accordance with a recent study that examined the association between Greenspace and brain-based magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI, measures in older adults. And the authors found that living in neighborhoods with more green space was not associated with a left or right hippocampal volume, which is, responsible for memory and learning. So this is also found in other research. Our study basically suggests that there are differing associations between green space and cognition based on the cognitive domain explained. So some strengths are that this is a large nationwide prospective cohort study, and that we have repeated measures of cognition. However, some limitations are that we do not have any information about the quality of nature exposure, whether these are parks or forests, or whether the vegetation has overgrown in vacant lots. So there is still a lot more to be done in this area. So far, I hope I have made the case that there is evidence that suggests that green space is beneficially associated with cognitive function across different stages of life. However, the literature on green space has been limited by coarse measures of exposure from satellite image. Sorry, that take a bird's eye perspective and cannot really identify specific features that might drive health outcomes. So this is where the future directions of my research come in. As technology advances, we have new tools that can help inform our research question. So Google Street Views allows us to measure our geographic context as we experience it. And it can be combined with time-varying nationwide street-level imagery to estimate personalized exposure metrics in prospective studies. Also, advances in deep learning have enabled us to make sense of what is in any image in any location and at a rapid scale, so that we go from our top-down satellite approach to something like this. In this project, I am using deep learning algorithms to identify specific features of nature down to the pixel level using Google Street Views. In particular, we are using the PSPNet algorithm that can predict, for instance, whether a given pixel in an image is a tree, grass, or a flower with 80 to 90% accuracy. The most direct connection between individuals and their environment is best represented by ground-based measures, but few studies have been able to incorporate exposure information from this perspective. So again, just to show how this is done, we are doing this for multiple cities across the country, and this is an example from Massachusetts. So to link this data, we created first a grid of points every 100 meters for all of Massachusetts. And we then pulled the closest image to each grid point from 2007 to 2020. And let's see if you can see this video. Can you see that? Yeah. So this video just shows the availability of Google Street Images across the year. So as you can see, there are some years that a lot of images weren't updated, but then we have years where we have very updated images. So we have been downloading massive quantities of Google Street View data. For every location, we're actually pulling 4 images for the 4 orientations. And then we process these images using deep learning algorithms and categorize each item in the image so that at the end of the day, what we get is a database like this, which has for each location the percentage of total trees, plants, grass, flower, water, etc. We have up to 150 different categorizations, and we're going to link these exposures to participants to look at Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And we're also very interested in sharing these data once they are processed. So as the US elderly population grows, it will also become more racially and ethnically diverse. For example, the percentage of Hispanic older adults is projected to grow from 24% in 2020 to 45% in 2060. And given the higher burden of dementia in some ethno-racial groups, understanding multi-level determinants of dementia in racially and ethnically diverse individuals is ever more crucial. However, most of the research has been done on white populations. We know that ADRD incidence is higher among African Americans. We also know that Hispanics tend to be younger at the time of diagnosis compared with whites. And notably, Greenspace has been associated with decreased physical activity, depression, and hypertension, and specifically a large proportion of neurodegenerative diseases and related cognitive decline can be attributed to precisely physical inactivity, depression, and hypertension. However, little research has been devoted to investigating the direct impact of Greenspace on Alzheimer's disease and related dementia, or the mediating roles of physical activity, depression, and hypertension. And finally, we also need to understand Greenspace in the context of other geographic exposures, because we're exposed to so many different things, right? To estimate which factors drive health, such as air pollutants, noise, built environment, and social environment. So these are the 3 aims of my R00 award from the NIA. So we recently published a paper using these novel metrics in association with sleep, which you know is also a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. And I just wanted to show you these results. So again, this was using data from Project Viva, and we looked at the association between Greenspace and sleep among children. We used deep learning algorithms to derive novel metrics of Greenspace. So we have percentage of trees, percentage of grass. We also had a percentage of all green space, which basically summed trees, grass, plants, and flowers. And then we also compared these results to our satellite approach of NDVI. And for sleep measures in early adolescence, participants completed more than 5 days of wrist actigraphy data. So we had sleep duration, efficiency, and time awake after sleep onset, which you know are very accurate measures of sleep as opposed to self-reported. For our three measures of sleep efficiency, and sleep duration, higher scores or better sleep. But actually for WASO, or time awake after sleep onset, higher WASO is worst. So just keep that in mind. So we evaluated associations with percentage tree and percentage grass, and also compared to NTDI. And our results suggested that Greenspace overall and specific features of Greenspace were actually not associated with sleep among adolescents in Project Viva, except that higher percentage of grass at mid-childhood was associated with higher WASO, so worse sleep. Also, when we stratify by neighborhood socioeconomic status, we observed beneficial associations, but for neighborhoods with high socioeconomic status, but unfavorable associations for neighborhood with low socioeconomic status. And the observed association between percentage of grass and insufficient sleep in neighborhoods of low socioeconomic status might be related to the differing health effects depending on vegetation types. For instance, a systematic review on green space quality and health found that health benefits were more consistently observed in areas with greater tree canopy, but not grassland. And a reason might be that due to their foliage, trees have the capacity to intercept airborne pollutants and buffer against traffic noise, whereas grass might not have the same range and levels of benefit. On the other hand, a systematic review on green space and health equity reported that parks in neighborhoods with different socioeconomic status have different qualities, which is not surprising. For instance, parks in low socioeconomic status neighborhoods tend to have lower maintenance than parks in more privileged communities. Also, interestingly, when we stratify by race ethnicity, we observe beneficial associations for Black participants. And research has shown that racial minorities experience a greater burden of environmental features, such as higher exposure to air pollution, neighborhood disorder, lower social cohesion, you name it. And racial ethnic minorities also have a high prevalence of insufficient sleep. So if the hypothesis that unhealthy sleep patterns among minorities contribute to racial ethnic health disparities is true, then ameliorating environmental features, and in this case, green space across racial and ethnic groups, could potentially improve overall cognition, overall population health. Sorry. So to conclude, just to remind that the goal end is, of course, to inform urban public health interventions to optimize healthy aging and help design healthy cities. I seek to reveal relevant pathways through which the built environment may influence health, and this is where the mediation comes in. I am also interested in solving the problem of consistency in epidemiologic studies, which basically is to answer the question, can we define our exposure in our analysis with enough clarity and specificity so that we can actually intervene on it? So I don't want to tell you green space is good for you. I want to tell you, right, but green space coming from more trees is good for you. You know, like be as specific as we can. And I believe that with the work with Google Street Views, we can do that. So last but not least, I want to end with mentioning some ongoing projects that I'm really excited about. I'm working on a proposal with John Jay and Colette Chube on gun violence, green space, and birth outcomes. I'm also working with Amelia Westlink, Mary Willis, and Lauren Weiss on a project on green space and mental health in Presto. Jennifer Weave and I are starting the collaboration on air pollution, green space, and dementia. And I recently got a BU Pilot Award to look at diabetes and green space in Mexico. And Cameron Reimer, my RA, has been phenomenal in helping me with this. And also, we're recruiting a postdoc with Eric Rubenstein to work on dementia-related research. I'm also part of the new Center for Climate and Health in the Urban Department, so I encourage you to check it out. And with that, I and I welcome any questions or suggestions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jimenez. That was a great presentation. Again, we'd like to allow anyone who has questions to please feel free to ask. And also Dr. Jimenez left her email on here, so if you do want to reach out personally, you are more than welcome to.
Hi, Dr. Jimenez.